Alright, me. It is late February, and yesterday, around this time, I meant to record it yesterday, but I got stuck doing a whole bunch of stuff. Yesterday, around this time, I finished reading Geraldine Brooks' Horse. Well, a couple notes. I'm filming in someone's classroom as I'm substitute teaching. Shout out to Miss Wagner. Know Miss Wagner for pretty much all my life. But yeah, so the novel itself, Geraldine Brooks' Horse. Geraldine Brooks is a really fantastic author. Right, has written a number of New York Times bestsellers, winner of Pulitzer Prize. So it's not a secret that this is a good book. I actually picked up this book in the Orlando airport because I finished The Road super quickly, and then the entire time I was in Universal, the only books that they had there were Harry Potter books, and so picked this up right when I got to the airport. Very, very good read. It's honestly, it's designed to be an airport book or like a commute book, in my opinion, because of the way that it's structured, right? We have the same thing that, I think see a lot in terms of, specifically for whatever reason, it seems to be focused on Southern America where this happens, where we're having a constant switching of narrators, right? So I enjoy it in that sense, right? It's not, I feel like it's probably a more contemporary thing that's been happening for the constant switching of narrators rather than sticking with one narrator throughout. My only issue with it, right, is the fact of how many there are, right? We went through The Sound of the Fury, which had 4 main narrators, but it was consistent throughout, right? It was like a whole section dedicated to that one character, versus Horse, which I stopped keeping track, but I think has like 7 or 8 different narrators, and they're each with like 5, 6, 7 page snippets, right? So there's not like a lot of consistency in that sense. Theme-wise, absolutely consistent, right? But in terms of narrator-wise, right, we're shifting a whole lot, and which is why, to me, I think it makes a very good commuter-type book, because it's not like a John Steinbeck or like a lot of these other, classical American authors where like you have huge chapters where it's like if you get stopped halfway through, you have to restart the whole thing. This is much more like, hey, if you have to get stopped midway through the chapter and you need to reread the chapter, that's not a big deal. At best, you're 3 pages in. So in terms of that, right, I think it's a very good book structure for what has been given, in that sense, right? Book itself, right, follows effectively three different sections of things, right? It follows Jarrett Lewis. Jarrett is born into slavery under his father, Harry Lewis, who Harry Lewis was also born into slavery and was eventually bought his freedom, and so has his own surname in Lewis, and so that's like I would say the major portion of this, right, is about Jarrett, right? Because Jarrett, throughout all of this, we learn that has this incredible ability with horses, right? And in his ability with horses, he ends up training and effectively planting himself onto, or the horse, I should say, plants onto Jarrett. And it turns out that it is the greatest, one of the greatest racehorses, and then the greatest stud sire in American history, right? And I should say this as well, right after, more towards the top. This book is based on real actual events, right? Through, you know, looking at Lexington, or looking at, you know, the paintings that are involved in this, and like the scenarios as a broad stroke are based in reality, but the characters themselves are fictionalized, right? And so we know that, right? I believe one of the paintings is referred to as Lexington with groom Jarrett, right? So we have an understanding that Jarrett was a real person at some point, but the whole events are fictionalized in some way, right? So broad strokes, real, specific details, fictionalized, right? But anyway, right, so that's one part. The second part comes from, the second main part we follow is effectively two researchers that go through in 2019, and what they're looking at, what they're doing is, one of them is effectively a fossil expert. It's a whole bunch of academia that I don't remember the exact names of. I apologize, Geraldine Brooks. But one of them, fossil expert, it gets contacted. They eventually find out that Lexington, this greatest horse of the 19th century, is effectively just collecting dust in the Smithsonian, right, or one of the attics. So dig it out, do some testing, figure it out. Along this, we have Theo, who is more interested in the art side of things, right? He's interested in these paintings in which, as he says, right, it's one of the few times that Black Americans get to look dignified in paintings at this time, and he's doing PhD research into that, right? Into art history and art meaning and things like that, right? So those are the two major timelines. The third timeline that exists comes from Martha Jackson, who is the person who owns the painting. Martha Jackson is, you know, just a famous art collector type. She was of like new wave Jackson Pollock type paintings, very experimental, very creative. And when she donated to the Smithsonian, or to an art museum, I don't remember which one, she had all these, you know, great new art, you know, pushing the edge expressionists, and then just one painting by Thomas Scott, who painted horses in the 1850s. And so it's just a, you know, part of this book is just based on, you know, how in the world did this painting end up with Martha Jackson, and why did she care to own it in the first place? So yeah, right. That's all that. The story as we follow, right? I'm not actually necessarily interested in terms of the story beats. What I'm interested in, what the story beats have to say, right? And I would say the biggest thing, right, and it is a concept that has been floating around in my head, but one that I have not fully nailed down until now, which is just the generalized concept that the way that slavery and enslavement has existed exists to still, right? And we see it exist through, you know, prison camps and using prison labor. But also socially it still exists, right? Just in a different form. And what we see throughout all of this, right, is that even though when we look at Jarrett, who is still someone who is enslaved, even when he has power in things, he has to be exceptionally thoughtful and considerate of what might happen or what might be said about him, right? And so what we constantly see is that there are either abolitionists or people that are trying to free or encourage slaves to be to run or escape. And Jared's feeling is that you don't actually understand what you're saying and how dangerous that is for me, right? Which is one of those things to just kind of grapple with in general, right? But we also see it is when we go to Theo in the present day, right? What ends up happening to Theo is Theo takes his dog on a run. It's kind of dark out. It's like 6-7 o'clock, right? They're in the middle of making dinner. He decides, hey, I'm going to go on a short run with my dog. His usual sweatshirt is not accessible, so he wears a black sweatshirt, and then he goes jogging, or he goes running. While he's running, he comes across a woman who has fallen, gotten hurt, and is not responsive, and so his immediate reaction is to go and help her, right? And then what ends up happening is Jared has his phone in his hand, is trying to get a hold of, like, just contact anyone. Police officer comes in. Theo raises his hand that has the phone in it and is then shot and killed, right? Because in the police officer's eyes, as is described, is that he came across a assault and robbery in progress. The assailant raised a metal object in his hand, and then the officer shot because he feared for his life, right? And it's one of those things, right, which I talk about, where I'm referencing into slavery existing as a social construct now, right? Is this kind of just concept in which, right, a person should not have to be perfect in order to be able to exist in the world, right? Is what Theo does a dumb move? It is, right? Something that I have been, implanted into me from the very start of going into teaching is that you never, ever, 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 under any circumstances whatsoever, put yourself in a room alone with a student that identifies as a female, straight up, right? And so what Theo does is socially a dumb move, right? Is that he, instead of getting someone else, right, his immediate reaction is to help, right? But mentally, right, that's the right move, right? That is what should be done in a society in which we expect that people are helpful and kind, right? And we want that to be our first reaction, right? Is that we want to go help people, right? But in Theo's case, it is dumb because from an outside perspective, right, he is a young black male who is wearing a black sweatshirt and is leaning over and standing over a young woman who is unconscious, right? But the question is that the first thing that you should think of, right? Should your willingness to be someone who tries to save other people then take a back seat to understanding how you are going to be perceived from an outside perspective, where everyone expects the worst of you, right? And so, right, and then this is kind of portrayed again, right, is that Theo, has all these, looks like great connections, right? Both of his parents were American ambassadors, he's in Georgetown and whatnot. And the reaction immediately, as it almost always is when these things happen, is, well, he should have been smarter than that, or it doesn't matter, only dangerous people wear black sweatshirts, things like that, right? And just in general, right, I always have to think about, okay, if this isn't a race thing, right, how would this shift if we were to change the race of the person that was doing it, right? And then give them all the same background, all the same sentiments, and then do the exact same thing to them, right? And my initial reaction is that if I were to be in that place, right, in which I was shot and killed as a 24, 25-year-old white male who is attempting to help someone who has just been injured, right, and I have all of these great connections through parentage, there will be an outcry, right? And I really do believe that. But it's one of those things, right, of where it just shows that the bonds that we hold over each other are no longer actual physical bonds in terms of property rights, but rather social bonds in which we anticipate and we expect as a society of what is going to happen with those things, right? And the same thing ends up happening with, as we explore with Jarrett, right, through being a person who has been enslaved, and what we just kind of generally see is that even though he has continuously been given power and things, right, and they recognize him as a good trainer or as a good person in general, right, he has to constantly ward against others, right? What ends up happening at one point is Mary Bark sneaks into his room effectively and trying to warn Jarrett about a whole bunch of things that are going on, and wants to make sure that hey, he knows everything. And Jarrett's first reaction is, "You cannot be here. Please get the fuck out," right? And it's because, right, even though that she's the one that initiated, and he has been trying everything in his power to get her out of his room that he resides in, if anyone comes across, right, and sees that she is in his dwelling, it is immediately Jarrett's fault, right? And Jarrett will be punished and blamed for it, right? No matter what, right? It's a continuation of the same social structure, right? So yeah, right. And I think that it's an idea that's been inside of my head for a long time. I just haven't put exact words to it. So thank you, Geraldine Brooks, for that. Other things this book really kind of discusses, right? It's one of those things where, once again, right, we talk about how a lot of America is built on and bred on the backs of people who were not credited whatsoever or given any compensation whatsoever, right? And one of those things that comes up is, right, we look at pre-war Southern America and then antebellum Southern America, right? Pre-war and after-war Southern America in horse racing, right? And the reality of it is that a lot of those, right, of what we now think of as like this preeminent, beautiful horse racing thing, right, you know, Preakness, Kentucky Derby, all that jazz, inherently stems from, right, the use of slave labor, right, and the use of slaves and enslaved peoples to, you know, make all this function, right? And the wealth and the power that was gained, and like the respect and all of that, right, all gets transferred to the owners, right? Not to, you know, the people who were enslaved who were actually doing the majority of that work, right? It all goes to the owners, right? All of that wealth and all of that respect and all that power, right? And it's just a continuation of things, right? It's just a reminder that, hey, you know, first of all, Black history is American history, right? But then also a reminder that a lot of the things that we view as being, right, very, you know, Southern, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, pillars, right? Pillars of power, pillars of structure. A lot of that has stemmed from the use of slave labor, right? And as we see through Jared's timeline, right, it's not even just about the fact that of whether or not you own enslaved peoples. It is about the fact that even if you don't own, you still are benefiting off the property and the ownership of them, right? And we see that, and we explore this through Thomas Scott, right, in which you know, Thomas Scott, the painter, at one point gives an idea that, like, he doesn't partake in the structure of slavery, right? He doesn't own slaves. He lives in the North, you know, all of that. But at the same time, right, he's still asking Jared to do a whole bunch of stuff, right? He's asking Jared to do X, Y, and Z, no matter where they are, and he never actually compensates Jared for that in any way besides the two paintings that he gives him eventually, right? So for all of the work that Jared does for Thomas Scott, right, his compensation is two pieces of art, right? And right, this harkens back into like the whole argument around the Civil War about it being about state rights and property rather than about slavery, right? First of all, states' rights to do what? Second of all, you also have to remember the fact that it wasn't about, to a lot of the people in Southern power, it wasn't about people because they viewed slaves as property, right? Not as people, right? But also just in general, right? Even those that did not own slaves, right, still benefited and profited off of the use of slave labor, right? And that ranges from, you know, just the fact that the use of slave labor to create and make things cheaply, but also things like entertainment, like horse racing, right? That's all that, right? I'm trying to think if there's anything else to talk about with this book off the top of my head. I think that's it. I think that's all I got, right? It's a very good book, right? And I'm sure I'm missing parts of it because reading it was late night in Orlando and on the flight, and then in between sections of substitute teaching. So I'm sure I missed part of it, and I apologize, Geraldine Brooks, if I missed part of it. But that is my opinions on horse.